Hi everyone, Carl Steele here, English 4113 slideshow for the 9th class. We're reading Robert Hayden's Middle Passage, modernist poem, but we're also reading a little bit of Gomes de Azurara, his chronicle of the discovery and conquest of Guinea, written in 1457. I have an image here of one of the two handwritten manuscripts of this document. This is a portrait of Henry the Navigator called the Infante in the manuscript. This is from Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Portuguese 41, which is available online, as is the other manuscript, which is at Munich. I've looked at both of them. So I'm going to walk you through this a little bit. This is not a topic I know a great deal about, but I've done a little research over the last 2 days, and I've tried to synthesize that for you here. So the story that Gomes Azurara tells is about the arrival of enslaved Africans. This is itself not a huge break with Portuguese practices because there is slavery already in Portugal at this time, but it's a little different from what slavery would become in the ensuing centuries, especially in the enslavement of Africans in the Americas. So at the time in Portugal, slavery is, as I read here in an article by Francois Sawyer, Muslim slaves and freedmen in medieval Portugal, in a journal published out of Madrid. There are enslaved Muslims, Christians who are enslaved Muslims, and they are not infrequently manumitted, that is, granted their freedom by the people who own them. They also can, through their own labor, perhaps save some money or put some money away and purchase their own freedom. This is practice that persists even in the transatlantic context through the 18th century, as we're going to see with Olada Equiano. And they may even be exchanged with prisoners, Christians, basically, who are held as prisoners or enslaved in places that are ruled by Muslims. So there's a lot of different practices of enslavement in Portugal at this time, and a lot of them basically would be incomprehensible to the way that slavery is going to look like in, say, Brazil or the Caribbean or North America in the ensuing centuries. So I want you to understand that just as race has a history, so does the history of slavery have a history, of course, that the two of them seem to be linked, especially in the modern era. The place that Gomes Azurara is talking about is, he calls it Guinea. This is a word that the Portuguese used for West Africa, south of the Sahara. It's a word that they call Guinea or Guineos. The origins of that word are unclear, and I dug around a little bit and found that it may be from a word in Tuareg, a language spoken by North African people called the Berbers, and I can't pronounce it. I'm just going to say Guinean, which might mean burnt skin or just black person. Basically, you have a lighter skinned group of Africans in the Sahara who describe darker skinned people with a word that might be itself a slur. So the Portuguese description of this region may be drawn from a slur that they didn't invent, but one that's taken from light-skinned Africans. Or it's perhaps from the name of a city, Guinea, which is an important trading city at the time on the upper Niger River. So it's either a name that's a slur or it's a kind of just recognition that this is of an important political entity. So it's unclear, but that's where the word originally comes from, possibly. So what's happened here is that the Portuguese have sailed further south on an expedition than they have done before, and they often describe this place they sailed past, the Cape Bojador, which is right around here, is extremely treacherous and extremely dangerous and full of scary sandbars that were going to catch your ship and wreck it. Now that description of the place is probably wrong, as I read here in this entry from an encyclopedia of medieval travel, because it's right near the Canary Islands, and Europeans had been sailing to the Canary Islands for decades at this point in a practice of conquest of people without a lot of powerful military technology, and they eventually, you know, conquered it and killed everybody who lived there. It's sort of a practice run for the Caribbean, frankly. And so why do they present Cape Bojador as so powerful and dangerous? Probably because they're just scared to sail further south. And eventually they do. And right around here, a place called King Blanco, they called it, they stopped and the traders, sailors did a raid into what's now present-day Mauritania and started capturing people to bring back to Portugal. So why did they do it and how did they justify it? Well, here's an entry from a book called Abolition, History of Slavery and Anti-Slavery. And in 1452, they received an official papal bull. So it's a pope is basically giving them a kind of legal opinion that says what you can do here is you can seek out these people and you can capture them and conquer them and set up camps to convert them to Christianity. That motivation to conquer and to convert, of course, are quite distinct again from what transatlantic slavery would become, where in the modern era, from say the 16th and 17th and 18th century on, especially, if an enslaved African person converts to Christianity, they're not going to be free in the Americas. It's just not going to happen. So that's itself a real break from what we see happening in this early period in the 15th century. There's also conquest is a real motivation. Again, conquest sort of drops out. You don't really see European conquest of Africa in a big way until really the 19th century. What you have instead is European trading posts where Europeans are trading with local African kings who are themselves conducting raids into the hinterlands and providing these Europeans with people to enslave. So the way this papal bull is described already gives you a sense that we're in a different world than what slavery would become. Okay, so I just wanted to call attention to a couple good openings to articles just to help punch up your own approach to your writing. And so you may want to just pause each one of these slides and read these two excerpts yourself, because I think they're really good models for how to grab a person's attention, right? Don't start with something that's incredibly general. It doesn't give anyone a big, a specific picture of what it is you're talking about. Don't do some kind of throughout history opening. Instead, try to get into the specifics of things as soon as possible and grab our attention. Think of it as a kind of jump cut, right? At the very beginning of a film, before we even get to the credits, where you just want to excite us and draw us in. So Herman L. Bennett's Sons of Adam, Text, Context, and the Early Modern African Subject in a journal called Representations from 2005 has a really nice opening here about the Portuguese sailing to what's now present-day Mauritania and a raid where they captured some people as prisoners and eventually slaves. So pause the slide and read that. I think it'll help your own writing. Similarly, pause the slide and read this. This is also a really good model. This is from a book whose name I forget, but I'll provide a link to it in the comment on the YouTube. And it's by a Harvard theologian. That's what I remember at this point. And I just want to point out where they are. Here's Cape Blanco. If you wanted to go on foot and walk all the way there from Lagos, we'd have to take a ferry right here, but it would take you about 545 hours, and it would not be so easy. Of course, they actually sailed. But again, this is a description of the arrival in Lagos, in Lagos, Portugal, of all the captured Africans who were captured down here in 1444. So we're really very much still in the Middle Ages. This is the situation that Gomes Azurara is writing about in the passage we read for today. So here's the situation. What's unusual is not that there are enslaved people. Again, Portugal had enslaved people. It's not even unusual that the enslaved people, some of them have darker skin than the Portuguese. That is itself not unusual because, of course, North Africa is Muslim. And so there's plenty of dark-skinned Muslims around in this region at this time, right? So that some of them might be captured in war and enslaved. Well, Portugal was familiar with that at this point. So what's unusual is that there are a lot of people, 235, that they come from sub-Saharan Africa, so that's unusual, and that their religion, they're probably not Muslim. So what are they? What do they believe? That's a little bit unusual and would have been shocking or surprising to the Portuguese Christians. And finally, the ritual itself, where of these 235 people, they're divided into multiple groups, and some of those people are given to the prince, and some of them are given to the church. And so there's this real practice of separation, which as you read the Azurara, you're going to see that this is actually quite upsetting probably for some of the people who are witnessing it. And certainly Gomes Azurara says he finds it upsetting himself. So August 8th, 1444 is an important date. So if you're reading the Azurara, which I presume you did, here's a link in the PowerPoint. Pay attention to these 8 things as you're working your way through. First, the tears of Gomes Azurara himself. He says, if animals can weep, so too can humans. He's not really animalizing anyone here. He's just saying humans, this is a basic minimum quality for any living thing, is that they feel sadness when other things feel sad, right? There's a kind of community of emotion among all living things. I think that's what he's saying. It's interesting that he's already tracking people according to various skin tones. That's unusual, perhaps. And he certainly ranks them by the lighter skinned ones he thinks of as more valuable or more attractive than the darker skinned ones. So that's already in place in 1444. Then he talks about the tears of the captured people or the enslaved people for a long time and kind of brings us rhetorically very close to them. We identify with them as we're reading that. And I wonder if that's actual empathy or if it's Gomes just showing off rhetorically what he can do as a writer. And so we can talk about that in class. He makes a reference to something called the Wheel of Fortune, which is this notion that if you're high on a wheel, you're going to draw down, and at the bottom, you're going to be in misfortune. It means that nothing in this world is safe or secure. If you're happy, eventually you're going to be sad. If your kingdom is powerful, eventually it's going to fall, and then it will rise again. It's basically kind of undoes this notion that the West or Europe or Christians are always going to be on top. Again, this very medieval notion that nothing in this world is secure or safe, and eventually that's going to get abandoned in the modern era. So there are various elements here that strike me as very medieval. All happiness is temporary. That's a very medieval idea. The response of the crowd seems to be upset, and they seem to be disrupting the separation of these people who are captive, right? There's a point, if you read on page 82, that they have to be held back, right? And so there's not a natural or automatic or learned tendency that the lives and emotions of African people are automatically devalued. That hasn't been learned yet, right? Again, racism has a history. It's also, as Zurara says, that these people he believes are easier to convert than so-called other Moors. And we can talk about what that means in class. But he's basically saying they're not Muslim, and so they're easier to be made Christian. And that is, I think, part of the hope that maybe there are people south or behind the Muslims who can be converted to Christianity and then used against them. It's still part of that dream that we saw in King of Tars. We see how they're treated, right? Are they treated like enslaved people? Are they treated like captives, like servants? They seem to be easily manumitted, that is easily freed. Again, we're not in the world that slavery would become 100 years or 200 years after this, right? Again, this has a history, and we're not yet what it would become in the Americas. He is also certain that they're grateful for these people who arrived because now they're leaving lives among much more wealth. Well, you might want to ask them if we could and see what they have to say. So he does talk about them being trained as Christians, about them being trained in literacy, about one of them who becomes a Franciscan friar. If we can find any record of work written by these people, that would be great. So I'm going to dig around maybe this weekend and see what I can find. Okay. So if you want to read more about this, there's a classic study here, A Social History of Black Slaves and Freedmen in Portugal. That's a place I'm going to look for maybe records of some of these Black people. Maybe they wrote works in Portuguese in this period. I don't know. This is a book from the early 80s, and you may want to pause and just read through this. He's basically talking about the various motivations that are offered for the Portuguese to go into Africa and capture people and enslave them. And the motivations are complicated, but eventually these are going to change in the ensuing centuries. I think that's Very important to recognize. Then here's another long article from a guy named Giuseppe Marcocci, Blackness and Heathenism, Color, Theology, and Race in the Portuguese World, circa 1450 to 1600. It's a journal published out of Colombia, South America. And this is an interesting place just where we're getting a sense of the gradual changing of the way that light-skinned Europeans thought about Black people. It isn't necessarily negative, right, at this point. It's varied and complicated, and in some ways looks much more heterogeneous than it would, say, around the year 1600 or 1700 or certainly 1800. So that's important to note, right? Race has a history, it's a cultural thing, and it's not simply a matter of Black versus white. It's that notion of simply being Black versus white binary is itself a historical artifact of the history of slavery. Okay, so one last thing I want to share with you, because I just found this today, and this is, I was looking at the two manuscripts of this work, because I was like, well, it's mid-15th century, therefore it's medieval, therefore there are probably surviving handwritten manuscripts of this, and I was not disappointed. So I found one in Paris online, and I don't read Portuguese. It's not a language I know, but the manuscript has chapter headings, so I can at least find the chapters that I wanted to look at. And here is, in the English translation, a discussion about the group of captives or slaves who were sent to the church. And Gomes Azurara writes, but before they did anything else in that matter, they took as an offering the best of those Moors to the church of that place, and another little Moor, who afterwards became a friar of St. Francis, that is a Franciscan, they sent to St. Vincent de Cabo, where he lived ever after as a Catholic Christian, without having understanding or perception of any other law than that true and holy law in which all we Christians hope for salvation. And so if you look at this manuscript, right, even if you don't read Portuguese, and I don't, you can see little bits that will tell you where you are. Here is Francisco, right? For example, there's that word. Here's Catholico. You can easily read that. There is Christian. There's an X for Christ. And it ends with salvaticum, right? Salvation. That's the last word of this section. And you look at this, and there's another sentence. And the Moors of that capture were in number 235. Where do you find that? It's right here in the margins. And I don't really fully understand what all this says, because again, I don't really know this language, but I can certainly see the word moros. I can see desta, which is probably, it's a preposition, and that is probably a word meaning capture. And there is the number 235 written out in some kind of Roman numerals. This is something we might talk about in class. I do think it's striking that the main body of the text ends with this salvation story and about conversion and about kind of individual achievements and God's looking out for particular individual souls. And then we have in the margins a kind of financial record, which is a massification of these people. It just says 235, right? Which is, these two things I think are really at odds with one another. This is about conversion of individuals. This is about treating people as cargo. So we can maybe talk about that in class as two competing motivations in this story. Okay, so what do I want you to take away here? One is that 1444 is an important date, both in the history of slavery and the history of racialization. Two, that the forms of slavery already present in Portugal by 1444 are quite distinct from what slavery would become in the New World. And two, that the forms of racialization are quite distinct from what they would become in later centuries. And four, the motivations that the Portuguese offer for capturing and enslaving Africans are really going to slough away or fall away in the ensuing centuries when it becomes simply a matter of making as much money as possible and then looking secondarily for some way to justify treating people as if they're just means to an end. Okay, look forward to us talking later today.